So I shall move that out of the way. So welcome and thank you everyone for registering and for being part of this important webinar today. A nuclear weapon-free world, 71 years in the making. Is there an end in sight? My name is Henderson. I'm the National Communications Coordinator for WILPF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, Australia, and I'll be facilitating today's webinar. To open the webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are located and across which this webinar takes place. And on the eve of the 71st anniversary of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, I also wish to acknowledge the traditional owners and others across the world whose lives and environments have been touched, damaged or destroyed by nuclear weapons and the nuclear industry. I'd like to go over, before we begin the content section of the webinar, I'd like to go over a few technical aspects so you know how to participate. You're all muted. You're in listen-only mode. We can't hear you and we can't see you. And that's how the webinar works, and that's okay. If the sound or the video goes wobbly or unclear, log out and log back in using the link that you were sent. Hopefully this will fix the problem. When you first join the session, the control panel appears on the right-hand side of your screen, and you'll see a question box. If you can't see it, you can click the green arrow tab to display it. Many of you who are already on the call have actually typed into that, so you know where it is. And we know that we have people from around the globe, which is beautiful. Now that you know where the question box is, you can submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the same question box. You can send these questions at any time during the presentation. We'll collect these and, to the best of our ability, address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And finally, we are recording this session. And also, as you may have seen on the first screen, we'd love you to tweet and to post in Facebook using the hashtags that I posted in the comments earlier in the comments box, and that's hashtag Hiroshima and hashtag Goodbye Nukes would be fantastic. Great, yeah. So our session today is presented by WILPF, and for our agenda will be introduction now. I'll have the three speakers in sequence: Helen Caldicott, Daniel Högsta, and also Ray Acheson. Then we'll move into a shared discussion between the speakers and Q&A time, and looking at what we can all do as a result of this webinar to take out into the world and to make a difference. And just to let you know that, for those who don't know WILPF, for 101 years WILPF has been challenging militarism, promoting disarmament and non-violent practices, advocating for women's equal participation in the prevention of conflicts and peace negotiations, and setting global standards for the protection of women with full access to their human rights. And our first speaker today is Dr. Helen Caldicott. I think this will be a wonderful opportunity to both learn from and to appreciate the enormous contribution that Helen has made over many years. So she's devoted over 40 years to an international campaign to educate the public about medical hazards of nuclear age and the necessary changes in human behaviour to stop environmental destruction. Among those many highlights, early on she played a major role in Australia's opposition to French atmospheric nuclear testing in the Pacific. She's been vocal and done brilliant work around virtually every issue in relation to this big area that there has been. She's received many prizes and awards, nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Linus Pauling, and has been identified as one of the most influential women of the 20th century, and an author of 7 books. And I think you'll agree with me that she's courageous, articulate, passionate, and a powerful advocate for citizen action to remedy the crises. She speaks up always where it matters. And last year, Helen's contribution was celebrated when WILPF Australia honoured her as a Centennial Peace Women Laureate for the major contribution that she's made. So I'll pass it over to Helen, and a very big welcome and thank you. And what I need to do now, excuse me, is unmute. Here we go. Helen, thank you. Can you hear? Can speak?
Will I speak now?
Yes, please. Thank you so much.
It seems very pertinent that today we're having this webinar on the abolition of nuclear weapons. If you look at the New York Times today, there's a big article by Sanger and Broad about the president having to make a decision to launch nuclear weapons. Weapons take only, hydrogen bombs only take about 6 to 8 minutes to hit America or Russia from submarines located near them, or 30 minutes from the land-based missiles. The truth is that every city, major city in the Northern Hemisphere is targeted in China, Europe, England, Russia, Canada, USA, and of course Australia. It's said that every city with a population of 50,000 or more is targeted with a nuclear weapon in America anyway. There are 12 hydrogen bombs, and they're big. Russian bombs are big, targeted on New York City alone. And I thought that I would read some of the data from the New England Journal of Medicine about a 20 megaton bomb dropping on Boston. Now, 20 megatons is really big, 20 million tons of TNT. The Hiroshima bomb was 13 kilotons, 13,000 tons. However, the Russian bombs are very big, they're not very accurate, and there are many targeted on Boston. So we'll extrapolate from that. So you won't hear the bomb coming in. It comes in at 20 times the speed of sound, explodes with the heat of the sun, and within a thousandth of a second, a fireball would form, enveloping downtown and reaching up for 2 miles in every direction. From ground zero. Temperatures would rise 20 million degrees Fahrenheit, and everything, buildings, trees, cars and people would be vaporized. And that was the first time that ever happened, was in Hiroshima, where people were vaporized, leaving their shadows on the concrete pavement. And I want you to really take this in, because it could be imminent. It could happen tonight or tomorrow by accident, design, by human error, or by someone losing the plot, having a brain tumor, or becoming psychotic and the like. Out to a distance of 4 miles from the epicenter, the blast would produce pressures of 25 pounds per square inch and winds in excess of 650 miles an hour. These forces would rip buildings apart and level everything, including reinforced concrete. Structures 4 and out to 6 miles from the center, the heat would vaporize automobiles, sheet metal, glass would melt. Out to a distance of 10 miles, the heat would still be so intense to melt sheet metal, and people of 500 miles an hour turning into missiles traveling at 100 miles an hour. Shards of glass rushing through the air at 100 miles an hour would decapitate people, enter people's flesh. The Pentagon has an equation about how far a piece of glass traveling at 100 miles an hour enters human flesh. And then there would be a firestorm of 3,000 square miles enveloping everything. Everyone in fallout shelters, should they get there, would be asphyxiated by the lack of oxygen used up by the fires and die. The area would be so radioactive that no one could really survive. And as the cities across America, because every city is targeted with many bombs, burn, a fire would spread north to south, east and west and envelop the United States of America. And you could say that too for much of Russia, for all of Europe, and also note that there are 400 nuclear power plants in the world. They would all melt down, adding to the radioactive fallout. England would just be dissipated and burn, even in the middle of winter. And then a huge cloud of toxic black radioactive smoke would be elevated into the stratosphere and stay there for many years, dropping the Earth's temperature because the sun wouldn't be able to shine through for up to 10 years, causing a short ice age. And everyone and everything would freeze to death in the dark. So what we're really talking about is the end of most life on Earth. I suppose the algae, the mosses would survive, and maybe the cockroaches. We don't know, we won't be here. But it's certainly the end of human civilization. Now, these weapons, America and Russia own about 93% of the 16,000 or so hydrogen bombs in the world. They're the real terrorists holding the world at nuclear ransom. Only they can destroy life on Earth. So North Korea could blow up a city. Everyone gets upset. So one city. I'm talking about the creation and maybe the only life in the universe. And that brings me to the presidential situation where Donald Trump asked the security advisor 3 times during the course of an hour, well, if we've got nuclear weapons, why can't we use them? Which just totally freaked everyone out. People don't know that there's always an officer walking behind the president with the football, a suitcase with the codes to start a nuclear war. The president has 3 minutes to decide whether or not to destroy life on Earth. He's got counterforce, that means you bomb only the missile silos, counter value where you only bomb the cities or you bomb both cities and missile silos. America still has a plan to strike first and win a nuclear war. That's the official policy of the United States. How dare they? The Russians don't want to lose a nuclear war. They think the same way with this masculine testosterone mentality. And so the way America would win a nuclear war is they would first decapitate, I like that word, take the head off Moscow and Putin, so it couldn't press the button. Then you land 2 missiles accurately on each missile silo in Russia and destroy them, and you win a nuclear war. The fact that, you know, nuclear winter would partly be created doesn't matter to the Pentagon. They think in terms of ordinary bombs. The Russians don't want to lose the war, so they've dug a huge cave in the Ural Mountains with a missile called the Dead Hand. And if they see missiles coming from America to win the nuclear war, they launch the Dead Hand, which then sends automatically by computer a signal to launch all the missiles in Russia. So we're in a situation which is extraordinarily dangerous. Nobody is talking about this in the presidential election. Hillary Clinton is a warmonger. She destroyed Libya virtually by destroying Gaddafi and the like. She's very close to the Pentagon General. She's very close to the neocons in the State Department who orchestrated the coup in the Ukraine. And the most important thing to consider is Russia wants to produce the neocons want to produce regime change in Russia. I mean, how dare they? They want to get rid of Putin. These people are literally, I'd have to say, psychopathic, if not sociopathics. And the way they're doing that is America promised when Gorbachev brought the Cold War to an end that she would not expand in the newly released and liberated Eastern European countries. She would not expand NATO. But NATO is necessary for the military-industrial complex here, Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, you name it. They need war. And so the head of Lockheed Martin, Norman Augustin, went to all the small little nations and said, hey, do you want to join NATO and be a democracy? For that, they had to pay $3 million to arm themselves. So that was good for Lockheed Martin. And they persuaded all these little European, newly released, liberated little countries to join NATO. So NATO now borders the Russian border. And America's conducting new exercises with large contingents of NATO troops. So nothing really has happened like this since the Second World War. Aggravating and antagonizing Russia, provoking Putin. And in medicine, we know that you don't provoke a paranoid patient because they're likely to do something really crazy. And our survival depends upon the sanity of Putin, that he doesn't press his button. These people are really provoking a nuclear war. The Ukraine situation, that was a coup orchestrated by the neocons in the State Department, Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland and the like. The new regime in Ukraine is run by Nazis and a man called Poroshenko, who's really a puppet of the United States. And this is very provocative again to Russia. And the New York Times continuously takes the side of the neocons and blames Putin for being aggressive. He's not being aggressive at all. In fact, if you read his speeches, he's being very moderate, thank God. What I would say to you, though, is we're at a very critical point in human evolution. And if we don't abolish nuclear weapons now, I think we're doomed. My prognosis is grim. And the only way we can abolish nuclear weapons, although 156 countries have signed an agreement they want to abolish weapons, is if America leads the charge. America doesn't want to give up its nuclear weapons. It's going to spend $1 trillion in the next 30 years to replace every single hydrogen bomb, missile, plane, submarine, ship, etc. They're crazy. And this whole thing is run by the military-industrial complex. They're going to spend $1 trillion, I said. So if America doesn't do the right thing, and most Americans are totally ignorant about what's going on, I think we're doomed. Russia wants to get rid of her weapons. She knows the consequences medically. She can't afford her nuclear weapons, and the whole system is defunct. She operates on an over-the-horizon radar. She's very frightened. And all other countries, if America rises to its full moral and spiritual height and does the right thing, then it has the moral authority to say to North Korea, no. To Japan, no. To Israel, who's got up to 200 hydrogen bombs, no, get rid of them. To Pakistan and India. Without America doing the right thing, of course, everyone wants to emulate her. And as they said, someone said in the Bible, see not the mote in the other person's eye, look instead for the mote in your own eye. There's a wonderful movement going on internationally to abolish nuclear weapons. But I have to stress, as a physician making a diagnosis and looking at all the factors, if America doesn't change, we're doomed. And I guess that's the end of my diatribe.
Helen, what a powerful and important point on which to finish, and thank you so much for that. Yes, for that overview and yeah, the shocking awareness. So it would be now timely if we turn to Daniel Högsta, and because Daniel has been involved in talks that have been going on this week and are going on now, and will be able to share with us. I want to get my notes. So Daniel is network coordinator for ICAN, the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. And the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons comprises 440 non-government organisations in almost 100 countries. And certainly WILPF and ICAN work closely together in monitoring and presenting at international venues. And Daniel, you've been present this week at the final session, I believe, of the Open-Ended Working Group, and we'll have some very current information. And Daniel, hi, I've unmuted you.
Hello, thank you very much, Chris. Yes, I first of all, I'd just like to say thank you to WILPF for putting this together and for the work that WILPF does in general on nuclear disarmament. And as Chris mentioned, ICAN works very closely with WILPF. We're very fortunate to have WILPF International as well as several WILPF sections as partner organizations. And I just want to recognize in particular WILPF's disarmament project, Reaching Critical Will, of which Ray Acheson is I mean, they do really instrumental work in providing some of the key reporting and analysis about what's happening, about what I'm going to talk about, which is the Humanitarian Initiative. And also thanks to you, Chris, for putting this together. I think it's a really great initiative at a perfect time. So, as I said, what I hope to do is give a bit of background about this movement called the Humanitarian Initiative, this thing, and what I think its significance is for nuclear disarmament. I'm going to try to speak as plainly as possible, since I know many of you are aware that the language of nuclear disarmament often is plagued by jargon and acronyms, and I've been at the UN today, so hopefully I haven't been infected by that. So I'll do my best to speak plainly. So what do we mean when we say the Humanitarian Initiative? I think if you've been following the nuclear disarmament over the last few years, it's probably inevitable that you've come across this term, or perhaps variations of it. But I think it can be broadly defined in two ways. And first of all, and perhaps more generally, it refers to this shift in language surrounding nuclear weapons, and it's a conscious shift. It's a concerted effort to reframe the nuclear weapons discussion away from these concepts of security, deterrence theory, these kind of doctrines, and into more human terms, so putting the human element back at the heart of nuclear disarmament. And I'm sure all of you have experienced, when you touch on the subject of nuclear weapons, when you hear about it in the news, in the media, it's more often you hear nuclear weapons discussed in terms of deterrence, of strategic stability, national security, preserving the power balance. So what's clearly missing is the human element. And secondly, and perhaps more specifically, I think the Humanitarian Initiative, in quotation marks, is this catch-all term for a series of conferences, of joint statements of governments representing this new political commitment to act in light and with this new evidence about the humanitarian consequences of nuclear disarmament. So next is why is this framing or reframing necessary? And the first thing I'd say is that in nuclear disarmament, we've seen that words do matter. And by speaking or by engaging in nuclear disarmament using this language of deterrence preferred by the nuclear weapon states, we're already making a crucial concession to those for whom the status quo has been, by and large, acceptable. We're kind of conceding that the primary consideration when it comes to nuclear weapons is not about what those weapons do to people. It's about this balance of military might that we're told is keeping the world safe, and as Helen pointed out very poignantly, is quite untrue, and it's false. So I guess the problem there is quite evident, right? By accepting that nuclear weapons have a value, and then speaking in terms of their strategic nature, we're conveniently not speaking about them in terms of weapons, and it's difficult to spur progress if we're starting from a point that already considers it okay to speak of nuclear weapons as something other than weapons that cause indiscriminate and unacceptable harm. The second thing, and obviously related, is that by putting humanitarian concerns about weapons at the center of discussion, we're leveling the playing field. The barrier to entry for non-nuclear weapon states is lowered. So it's no longer a matter of the few, the nuclear weapon states, dictating the terms of the debate because they're the only ones who have the security concerns and these are theirs and theirs alone. No, we're rejecting that. We're saying that nuclear weapons are a global humanitarian issue, a global threat, and it's a matter for all states to discuss and resolve. And indeed, it's a responsibility for all states, non-nuclear weapon states and nuclear weapon states alike, to approach. So strategically, that means you're seeing a shift away from states that have demonstrated the least interest in getting rid of their weapons, the nuclear weapon states, to the states who are equally threatened by the existence of these weapons and do not accept the inherent value in these weapons as a tool of national security. So you're kind of flipping who's going to lead the charge to nuclear disarmament. And thirdly, just a small strategic, not a small one, a major one, but quickly mention that we've learned from past processes, and we're looking at when ICAN was started, we looked at very much at the lessons learned by these other weapons that used humanitarian disarmament as a clarion call for action, and that's the processes to ban landmines and cluster munitions. Obviously, very different weapons from nuclear weapons, not quite having the same political ramifications perhaps, but the weapons that were ingrained in the military doctrines of these countries, and we've seen a massive stigma attached to these weapons today, and that's kind of what we would like to do with nuclear weapons as well. So if we just go to the next slide, I think it's just to cover some of the milestones. I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's kind of very government-centric, and I don't want to give the impression that it's been an initiative that's kind of only been started and maintained by governments, but perhaps just to give an overview of where we've come. So I think the start of what many consider to be the start of the Humanitarian Initiative was in 2010, when this phrase, which seems quite banal at this point, but it was quite significant at the time, is the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, was included in the final report of this Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Conference, kind of this very staid and conservative forum for nuclear, in terms of affecting nuclear disarmament. And since that time, this humanitarian perspective has really grown. So we've seen that there's been these joint statements at these traditional forums at the UN General Assembly, at meetings of the NPT, where the state support for this humanitarian concern has grown from 16 to 155 states in its most recent iteration. And then we've also seen how the Humanitarian Initiative has moved away from these traditional forums, where it's quite challenging to get anything done, into its own kind of space. And we've seen that most clearly with these humanitarian impacts conferences, which some of you may have heard about. The first was in Norway in 2013. The second and third were both in 2014 in February and December of that year, and with most recently culminating with 155 states in Vienna. And these conferences talk a little bit more in the next slide. But most recently, there's been the establishment of this UN working group, which Chris referred to earlier, which is taking place right now. So in terms of the humanitarian impacts conferences, if we just go to the next slide there, these are kind of considered to be at the core of the core of the Humanitarian Initiative, because they're the first conferences of their type that are focused on expert evidence, excuse me, related to the humanitarian impacts of nuclear weapons. So kind of the first of their kind, at least in the last decade or so. And I think it's important to recognize, I think, it may be quite easy to write off the fact that, nuclear weapons, they obviously have terrible impacts, but it's important to recognize that their major achievements, major new evidence about the scope of the nuclear weapons, of a detonation of nuclear weapons, and the risks actually of accidental or intentional detonations, which we assume or have been led to believe are very low, but in actual fact are much higher than we are led to believe. And then it's kind of a very important addition to this dialogue. There's also been, I think, for those of us who have attended these conferences, I think there's been very poignant the testimony from the Hibakusha, the survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the ones who've been affected by the legacy of the nuclear weapons detonations in those cities. That's really kind of led us back to this kind of human perspective of what these weapons actually mean. And I think if anyone here has heard Setsuko Thurlow Hibakusha, who survived the detonation of Hiroshima when she was 13, it's impossible not to feel the kind of visceral injustice of these weapons, continuing to pose this threat that they do. And eventually, the Humanitarian Initiative Conference have shifted from a very factual, evidence-based approach into a more political nature. So the evolution has been to first identify, what the impacts of these weapons are, and then the logical extension of that is, gosh, what do we do about these weapons? And I think we've seen that very clearly with this initiative called the Humanitarian Pledge, which was mentioned has got the support of over 120 states, and is kind of a political commitment by these states to act based on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons to start negotiations to prohibit and leading to the elimination of them. So I think just to get to what ICAN comes from in this initiative, where we see this going, what we kind of see as important is this idea of banning nuclear weapons, this idea of a legal prohibition on nuclear weapons. And I think for many governments and civil society from the outset of the Humanitarian Initiative was recognized that this reframing would provide an opportunity to change the game. And from ICAN's perspective, and I think several governments, it was clear that when we're confronted with the evidence and the true threat that these weapons pose, as well as the understated risk and the urgency to action, it's clear that we need a rejection of these nuclear weapons, and it's clear that there's an opportunity to forge a new path in nuclear disarmament by getting a legal rejection, a legal treaty that prohibits the weapons. So in addition to the kind of ethical basis for that, it's also it's also it's going to have normative in international law and practical components in terms of facilitating advocacy efforts in nuclear weapon states and other states that are kind of generally resistant to nuclear disarmament. And the key is, I mean, some of these put some key phrases here in relation to nuclear weapons is we hope that there's going to be a negotiating process which is open to all and blockable by none, and effective even without the participation of nuclear weapon states. So the key there is that nuclear weapon states can't hijack this process as they have with other processes related to nuclear weapons. And I mean, while this treaty wouldn't mean, and nobody implies that it would entail the elimination of nuclear weapons on day one of its being brought into force, it does kind of change the game in nuclear disarmament. And perhaps we can get into that a little bit more in the question and answer section. But it also provides a huge opportunity for bringing the debate back into the public eye. So where we're at now is this thing called the Open-Ended Working Group, which is not a very, in terms of a campaigning perspective, it's not a very sexy thing to sell externally. It doesn't have that kind of appeal to the mass public. It was established by a UN resolution to identify effective legal measures, provisions, and norms, and it's in the process right now of negotiating recommendations that are going to be submitted to the UN General Assembly, and that's that has the potential to spark a resolution, or to lead to a resolution at the UN General Assembly, which starts negotiations towards a treaty banning nuclear weapons. So it's kind of a very significant moment for the Humanitarian Initiative, and it's kind of the real, perhaps the tipping point where this initiative goes really into the direction of a political change. And as Chris mentioned, the final session started today, and we really saw a kind of a battle between the so-called progressive approach states, which is a kind of a term for the governments who are in nuclear weapons alliances with the nuclear weapon states, military alliances based on nuclear weapons, and the overwhelming majority of states who have led the charge for this humanitarian initiative and are quite clear that the next step is a ban treaty. And so just the reactions that this humanitarian initiative has caused, I think there's been this renewed energy and momentum, a sense of optimism in nuclear disarmament. And I think that's recognized across the spectrum, even by those who aren't happy that this is happening. It's kind of impossible to deny that there's this renewed sense of optimism in multilateral nuclear disarmament that there hasn't been before. There's been a real success of the humanitarian initiative has been to involve new actors and new stakeholders in this, not just traditionally in the disarmament realm, but also in the environmental field, public health. So much broader than strictly just a disarmament focus. And obviously there's been pushback. There's been, and I've got three terms here, the step-by-step building blocks and the progressive approach. And these are the ways that the resistant states, they're often referred to as the weasel states in these meetings that we're at, not officially of course, but they've kind of reframed themselves to try to rebrand themselves to make their proposals for nuclear disarmament seem fresh, when actually they're just saying the same thing that they've always said. And it's getting more and more fierce, and they're starting to work much more in a group. But I mean, that's the sign that we have, and I think we take that as a positive, that we're really starting to make an impact. What's next is, as I said, we're hoping that after the negotiation of a final report at the Open-Ended Working Group, that should take place on the 19th of August, we're hoping that those recommendations will be taken to the UNGA, the General Assembly, and that will lead to this resolution that mandates the start of negotiations on a nuclear weapons ban. And the hope is, and I think the majority of states at the Open-Ended Working Group have supported negotiations taking place in 2017, which is it's going to be a crucial moment for us. So in terms of, for those of you who are wondering how to get involved in ICAN with this work, a very basic thing to do, we've set up this tool on www.goodbyenukes, which is a tool to email your government's delegation at the Open-Ended Working Group and tell them that they support a ban. Tell them to support a ban. And I think if we've seen anything with this humanitarian initiative, it's how responsive governments have been to voices in civil society. Tomorrow, I mean, down the road, I think we always encourage the partner organizations of ICAN to try to see how you can inject this narrative, humanitarian initiative, humanitarian narrative into the work that they do with our partners. We always encourage them to play to their strengths. If they're focused on financial aspects of weapons financing, we encourage them to take action on that. If they're from a public health standpoint, environment, you know, there's that the destructive power of nuclear weapons is so broad that it kind of fits into a wide variety of fields. And third is join ICAN. If you've got a partner organization that you think would be interested in this, you can find out information about the how to join on ICAN, our website, icanw.org. And also, if you're just an individual, there's still also actions you can take. And I'd encourage you to go to our website as well and join the newsletter to find out for more action. So thank you very much, Chris. And I'm sorry I took a little bit too much time there, but hope that helped.
Thank you, Daniel. That was brilliant. I'm sure that everybody else listening will feel like me, that, or at least that I've suddenly been brought into such a deeper understanding of what's actually going on and the importance of the moment right now. And so thank you for making that clear and showing us possibilities for movement. That was great. So I'd now like to introduce, changing the muting's over. I'd now like to introduce Ray Acheson. Ray is Director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of WILPF. For a decade or more, she's researched, monitored and reported on international processes related to disarmament and arms control. I've been hearing about it for a long time, and it's an honour to now have her part of this webinar. At the United Nations, she's the NGO UN liaison and coordinator for nuclear disarmament, and she's worked on getting states to negotiate a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons. And Reaching Critical Will, the body that she leads, Reaching Critical Will actually leads WILPF's analysis and advocacy for disarmament and investigates the gendered aspects of the impact of weapons and of disarmament processes. The focus is very much on creating change by altering discourse and promoting new perspectives and approaches. So yeah, Ray, welcome, and we look forward to your take on this.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Really appreciate it. And I know it's pretty early in Australia, but it's also kind of late at night in Geneva. So big shout out to Daniel and Mia and Jessica and Josephine, who have all been over at the Openended working group all day and are now on this call. That's pretty great. It's you're very articulate given what kind of day you've had, Daniel. So thanks a lot. I wanted to talk a little bit about the broader context in which our movement for banning nuclear weapons is taking place in right now, because I see nuclear weapons as a key piece of a much bigger puzzle of our world. And a lot of that has to do with power and politics and money, and also other inequalities, class, race, and gender. I don't want to talk too long about each of these things, but just wanted to touch on them quickly. In terms of power, I think one of the best ways that we're seeing this very visibly right now is how things are playing out in the Open-Ended Working Group. Daniel mentioned the group of states calling themselves the progressive approach, which is a very large misnomer considering that they're trying to prevent any progress from happening. And in many ways, we're watching them unravel. They're having a tantrum, an international tantrum, about losing their grip on the power of the status quo. The nuclear armed states haven't even bothered to show up. These states are their proxies, trying to disrupt the overwhelming majority and the momentum that's been gathering now for several years. And their arguments are extremely problematic. For those of us that have followed these international discussions for a long time, you can see this retrenchment of support for the continued investment in nuclear weapons, which is really quite alarming and goes against their stated commitments to a nuclear weapon-free world. It goes against their commitments to the Non-Proliferation Treaty as well. There's a lot of countries in this group that are basically saying how important nuclear weapons are to their security. And it became so frustrating in May that I think it was the delegation of Jamaica basically saying, well, why don't we all just get nuclear weapons then? Which is the logical extension of their argument, which is of course not their point. But their point is that they want to maintain monopoly on massive nuclear violence, and they feel that they are losing that grip. The discourse through the Humanitarian Initiative and the movement that has been building over the past few years through that initiative has mounted a huge challenge to their control over the discourse and over the weapons. And I think that's something really important for us to pay attention to moving forward. Which brings me to the politics aspect a little bit. We've known this for years, since the NPT was created, basically. The injustice of the current nuclear weapon control regime, which is what it is, a control regime. It has disarmament, of course, in the NPT. The nuclear armed states are supposed to eliminate their arsenals and negotiate together to do that. Other countries are not supposed to be sharing nuclear weapons, and yet they do, and use the NPTs as justifying those actions. So there is some injustice in the way that the treaty has been set up and the subsequent control regimes have been set up, and the way that they are interpreted and applied, which is quite discriminatory, and which has been a complaint of non-nuclear armed states for a very long time. And this is the first time that we're really seeing those states who don't believe that this status quo should continue actually saying, well, what is it that we can do in this situation that is different from what's been tried before? And that's what's really key about the ban treaty. The ban treaty is a bit different than other approaches that have been tried. Everything that has happened from anti-nuclear activism over the last 4 decades has been crucial in bringing us to this point. Everything has built on each other. But this is a very new approach that is sort of doing an end run around the nuclear armed states and looking to see what are the weak nodes in the system that sustains their threat of massive nuclear violence, the institutions that uphold that threat. How do we tackle those institutions if the states and the interests upholding them aren't going to cave into their own legal obligations or international pressure that we've seen so far? And the ban treaty is a really interesting way to do this. And one of the things I wanted to talk about in particular that the ban treaty offers us is attacking the money. Now, Helen talked a little bit about the military-industrial complex and its importance and role in the world and upholding the threat of massive nuclear violence and those institutions. How does the ban treaty affect that? Well, the way that we see it possibly having an impact here is through divestment of funds, a prohibition of investment in companies that produce nuclear weapons, which would affect pension funds, other investment portfolios. We see this already. Daniel mentioned cluster munitions and landmines, looking at those processes for lessons. We've seen this with those weapon systems having a really big impact in terms of the financial gain that can be made from investing in these weapon systems. We've seen companies stop producing them because they are no longer profitable because of the legal prohibitions against these weapons. And one of the interesting things that we found with nuclear weapons is we've already had a divestment campaign going on nuclear weapons for several years. And when campaigners first started this work, in Australia actually, they found that when they called up to pension funds and banks and asked about their investment portfolios in nuclear weapons, even the ones that had divested already from cluster munitions said that they hadn't done so on nuclear weapons because these weapons were not illegal. They didn't see the NPT as making nuclear weapons illegal, which is one thing that the ban treaty, as Daniel said, offers us, is across the board legal obligation that to not have anything to do with nuclear weapons, essentially, which takes us a lot further from the NPT and closes a lot of its loopholes, and also makes it clear that they are prohibited for everyone. There's no loophole for 5 states to possess them until they get rid of them. There's no loopholes for other states to store them on their territories in case there's another world war. It would make the playing field level for everybody, and that's one of the goals of a ban treaty. One of the arguments, of course, that we hear about nuclear weapons within the nuclear armed states, we heard this very clearly from the UK recently in its debate about renewing Trident, and we hear it in the United States all the time as well, is that nuclear weapons create jobs. So there's this economic angle, that no country wants to eliminate a good jobs program. But if we actually look at the kind of jobs that nuclear weapons create, we see job opportunities for extremely well-educated, mostly white people who have degrees in science to work at nuclear weapon labs. We're not talking about jobs that provide the community at large with employment, and we're not talking about a large number of people either, and yet this is one of the most common arguments that we hear. And it plays on this sense of social justice, but it sort of upends it in a way, which brings me to the inequalities argument about nuclear weapons and the broader context. So there's this class issue in terms of who is profiting from nuclear weapons. There's also a race issue, which if we look at, in particular, testing of nuclear weapons, who has had to suffer the most from the development of nuclear weapons by any country that has tested them? It's mostly been indigenous people, either within the countries themselves, such as the United States, or on the Pacific Islands, where countries like the UK and France and the US tested their weapons off their own shores. So there's a racial inequality as well around nuclear weapons. And then there's also a gender inequality. And this is something that WILPF has a lot to say about, given that we are a women's peace organization. And just really quickly, I wanted to touch on 3 key ways that gender issues intersect with nuclear weapons. One is in terms of patterns of harm, and this is sort of the most straightforward, visible way that you can see nuclear weapons having a gender impact, and that's on the physical ramifications that are different between men and women's bodies. Women face different impacts from the use of nuclear weapons, particularly when it comes to reproduction and maternal health. There is also the issue of social stigmatization. You'll hear many of the Hoekstra who were women speak about how they were not able to marry, they weren't accepted by their families anymore. There's a lot of social stigmatization that comes with being a survivor or victim of conflict that are often unique to women depending on the social situation. So that's one sort of visible way that nuclear weapons have a gender impact. The other 2 are less visible, but I would argue even more important. One is around discourse and approach. I think we all know about some of the stuff that was written in the 80s about nuclear weapons, which is extremely phallic and sexist in approach. But even more insidious than that is how deep-rooted nuclear weapons are as a symbol of a very particular, very violent form of masculinity. And this type of masculinity harms everyone, regardless of your gender identity, sexual orientation, sex. It's the idea that men are powerful, strong, willing to use weapons. This conception, this sort of hegemonic conception of what it is to be a man, is very entrenched with the nuclear weapons discourse. And you can see this all the time in the news about leaders not being strong enough to use nuclear weapons. I mean, you only really have to look at some recent headlines to see examples of this within this election cycle in the United States to get a taste of that. And this forms dichotomies around what's practical in terms of disarmament or armament, modernization of nuclear weapons versus eliminating nuclear weapons. And it makes it really hard for people to see disarmament and prohibition of nuclear weapons as a practical way forward that isn't about weakness. So that's a really interesting thing I think that we need to pay attention to as well. And that also gets us to diversity in disarmament and arms control, the diversity of perspectives, the diversity of human bodies and identities that are participating in the discussions about nuclear weapons and disarmament. It's very controlled for anyone that has been in a nuclear weapons meeting. There may be many women in civil society attending the meeting, but there's still not very many women that are participating at high levels in government, the United States being one exception. on disarmament portfolios in particular. So this is a problem within governments. Recently, a researcher, Elizabeth Miner, has been doing some good work on looking at representation of women in these meetings, and it's not at all surprising, though it is still disappointing, how few women are actually represented in these conversations, and of course also how few people of varying gender identities or sexual orientations are represented in these meetings as well. So those are just a few sort of bigger context issues that I think are useful in thinking about when we talk about ways forward on nuclear disarmament. The reason why I think all of this matters is because I think it's important for understanding our opposition. It's important for understanding the perspectives, the cultural perspectives of the governments that are refuting change, that are having trouble grappling with the momentum that has been built up around the Humanitarian Initiative. But it's also about articulating alternatives in a broader context outside of nuclear weapons themselves. I think that one of the main things I like about the ban, and where the ban really comes from, is from a place of hope and from a place of belief that we don't have to live with the current order that we live with, that we don't have to do this to each other, that we don't have to be violent, that we don't have to rely on these heinous weapons of mass destruction in order to protect ourselves from each other, and that we can help each other stop. I like that approach of the ban treaty in that it's a bunch of countries who are allies with the NATO states, other countries relying on extended nuclear deterrence, and even the nuclear armed states themselves. These aren't their enemies coming up to them and saying, you have to give up this weapon of power. These are their friends who have alliances with them across the board on a range of issues, saying, you have a problem, and we're going to help you overcome this problem because we feel that you've got yourself so tangled up in this mess of nuclear weapons, and here's a way out. So that's a very positive, non-antagonistic way, I think, to promote the ban treaty among skeptical actors. And I think one of the most important things we can articulate around here, as Daniel has done very well, is that the ban is very practical, and it has a lot of normative, legal, political, economic, and social effects on the landscape that surrounds nuclear weapons. So even if we, as activists or as non-nuclear armed states, can't physically touch the weapons themselves, can't go in and dismantle them, we can have a lot of impact on the structures that sustain them. And I think that we have the best opportunity that we've had in a very long time to affect that landscape. And I'm really excited to the discussion here to see what people are thinking about that. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Wow. Wow, thank you very much, Ray. Very, very powerful and illuminating. And I think that, yeah, what I'd like to do now is to open it up to the four of you, and I thought perhaps three of you, and I thought perhaps a way to do that might be to start off by reiterating the I guess the suggestions that have been made so far from Daniel in terms of, you know, the thing, encouraging governments to support that ban, and you know, certainly spreading the word and connecting with organisations. And I guess, Bruna, in terms of your work, Ray, too, is joining WILPF and actually, you know, really getting involved and knowing what's going on. I think this webinar and your conversation is moving that ahead quite a lot too. Just wondering what else you might add in there for Ray or for all of you. And it would help a lot, pardon me, well, I'm actually going to unmute you now. There we go. All the speakers are actually now unmuted.
Great. I guess I'll go first. I mean, I think yeah, in terms of what people can do, I think as this process gathers steam, and I'm thinking of just the negotiation process that starts next year. I mean, I think right now, perhaps in the media, well, not perhaps in the media, the Humanitarian Initiative perhaps has flown a little bit under the radar. We in the campaign, we get quite excited when we see reference to this in one of the big media sources, and it's picking up more and more. So I think, I mean, this whole game is gonna be this whole process is going to change dramatically once negotiations are underway. I mean, at that point, it's going to be picked up quite a lot in the media. We hope there's going to be a lot more pressure from states, nuclear weapon states on their allies in the nuclear alliance states, and also on the states that are leading this process. That's all to say that while we can't afford to think that our work is done as soon as the negotiations start. So there's a lot of preparation that we can do. I mean, we as a campaign and partner organizations for next year. But I think it kind of goes back to the points that I was making is kind of figuring out where your biggest impact can be as an individual, as an organization, for when this gets going. And if it's you've got particularly good media contacts, or that's something you can cultivate over the next year, or anything that load, how can you prepare for this process to get started? And what are the kind of the particular challenges and obstacles you think that your government will face in this process? Or if you're from a country like Australia, for example, there's a lot of hard work to do there, despite all the amazing work that WILPF Australia and ICAN Australia have done there. I mean, there's a lot to prepare for there. So I think it's just about preparation.
Thank you very much, Ray. I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Daniel. Ray, would you like to add in there?
Yeah, I think that Daniel summed it up pretty well. There's a lot of work to be done in terms of talking to our governments and also to each other, and particularly for those in nuclear armed states, it can be a bit difficult to understand what you can do. But there's a lot that you can do to set the groundwork, as Daniel says. And then there's also a lot that can be done in terms of working with allies across the world. And I think that's one of the best things about these webinars and technology like this, and also the opportunities the international meetings provide, even if you can't be at them yourself. So getting a sense of what's happening around the world and bringing that back for discussions within your own communities and organizations and groups that you're working with, and connecting up with the media as much as possible as well. This is something that is going to probably really take off soon. And laying the groundwork now with journalists, getting them prepared with backgrounds, I think is really key and something that we need more of.
Thank you. Actually, I'd just like... Helen, please.
I want to congratulate all of you on the amazing work you've been doing. And it's wonderful that... from my perspective, a younger generation are taking this on, and I think it's a different approach to the approach that we've used in the past, and it's absolutely fascinating. And I know that many countries are deeply concerned about this, but I guess I come back to the point I made before. I've been in the United States now for about 6 weeks. And watching television, which has no information at all on it, it's mostly advertisements, watching how Fox and CNN have promoted and, in fact, organized Trump to be so popular, watching the devious ways that the military-industrial complex operate here, knowing that 65 cents out of every federal discretionary tax dollar goes to killing, to the Pentagon, $1 trillion a year. I think what you're doing is magnificent. And I think that the pressure that the United Nations and all nations on earth could exert on the United States in its belligerence towards Russia, but towards the most powerful military-industrial complex the world has ever seen, is good, and it could be effective to a degree. But I have to go back to my experience in the 70s and 80s. When I first came to America in 78, almost every person said it was better to be red than dead. And that was a very disturbing thing. And so I organised 23,000 doctors to talk about the medical effects of nuclear war. And the truth is, in 5 years, 80% of Americans opposed the thought and use of nuclear weapons. And I go back to what President Jefferson said: an informed democracy will behave in a responsible fashion. This so-called democracy, if it indeed is one, is totally uninformed at the moment, and I know many countries, especially European countries, are much better informed about, you know, the sort of the impending annihilation of everyone. And the conference that Ray spoke at last year at the New York Academy of Medicine, I think called The Impending Threat of Nuclear War, is now to be published in a book by the New Press called Sleepwalking to Armageddon. And I guess that's how I see, this is quite apart from the work that you people are doing, which is absolutely stupendous, but that's how I see this country sleepwalking to Armageddon. Unless these people in this country are educated, and they're really good people, they respond wonderfully to education. And the only way to educate people in America now, which is the driving force of this whole thing, is through the media. And the media are determining the fate of the earth. I just would like to put that in for people to understand the most enormous powers that we're facing, that the world has really never, ever seen before. Ray's points about the masculinity of nuclear weapons, and I wrote my big book, Missile Envy, talking about this, is absolutely right. I'm writing a book now called Why Men Kill and Why Women Let Them, addressing this issue. But I just want you, I suppose as a physician, I have to, when I make a diagnosis of a patient, get all the tests and the like, you have to be really open-eyed and honest about what's going on. And I think you need to also take in this particular element of the whole, not nuclear arms race per se, but the nuclear power that dominates the planet, and that is actually the United States.
Thank you, Helen. Look, I'd like to add in, actually, first of all, an apology, because I think that my questions that I was pulling together, I think may have been showing up on the screen. It wasn't intentional. I'd like to invite all the participants, if you have a question you'd like to add, you'd like to present to the panelists, please do so. That would be great. We've had a few already, which we can perhaps now turn to stimulate the conversation. First of all, I'd like to say there's been a couple of queries about how soon the recording might be available. I know folks would love to be able to use it for your events around Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day. I think that the recording needs to be translated, I think, and it may take like a day or a couple of days. I'll do it as quickly as I can. I don't think it'll be ready in the next few hours. I believe that it takes longer than that. So what I'd like to do now is I'll just go back to my dashboard with the questions that have been provided. One of those from Nelson: I believe that abolishing nuclear weapons is the next step in our human evolution. Any thoughts about that? It's very much something that women would agree with, since there may be the archetype of what it means to be human.
I'd like to come in on that. Yes, I do think that. I think from a biological perspective, an evolutionary perspective, if you look at humankind at the moment, we're an evolutionary aberrant. I once asked Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer, if he thought there was any other life in the universe, and he paused for a long time and then he said no, and I said why? And he said because if ever any species had evolved to our state of development, they would have destroyed themselves. It is, yes, it is a change in us that has to happen to our better instincts, our more noble instincts, and I believe that women must play an imperative role in that, because 2% of us are women, and we don't step up to the plate nearly enough. in any area, really. And so I think, in a certain sense, women are the golden key to the future. I'm not putting down the wonderful men who are involved in this, but it is the next stage in evolution. If we can overcome this, we can overcome many, many other things. So I agree with that.
Great. Thank you. Anyone else like to add into there? Okay, cool. Thank you. Also from Nelson, it's time to put those 25,000 doctors together again and make public service announcements during the UN working group presentations and the General Assembly deliberations. Is more a comment. And from Marie Clem in Australia, from WILPF, what has been the impressions of Australia's post in deliberations position? Sorry, what has been the impressions of Australia's position in deliberations of the OEWG?
I'm happy to come in on that. Australia, I think, is yeah. I don't know. I don't have any good news for you, Marie, if you're Australian, but Australia is kind of one of the major antagonists for us. They're leading this group, or they're seen in some ways as leading this group of states that are very opposed to the Humanitarian Initiative and to a ban treaty. They were very active, very talkative today, trying to poke holes in the arguments. Not so effective today, but they've taken on a bit of an organizing role for the group of states that are that we refer to as the weasel. So that's quite unfortunate, but I'm afraid I don't have better news for you there. But I think, there's hope for Tim. My colleague Tim Wright from ICAN Australia, he always convinces me that there's hope. There's hope for Australia.
Can you name people? Can you name the people, the Australians who are operating at this level with you, please? I'd like to know who they are, so I might be able to do something.
You mean the diplomats?
Yep.
Well, yeah, but there's the Ambassador Quinn is the head of the delegation.
Quinn?
Yes, and then there's Ian McConville, who's he's kind of the kind of enemy in chief.
McConville.
Yeah, I can send you his name later.
Yes, would you do that, please, both of them? My
Absolutely.
brother's next to me. I'll see what I can do.
Yeah, well, I don't think it's their position. It's obviously not their position personally. They do feel like
it's a
they're
government position, obviously, yes. But we'll see. Thank you very much.
That'd be great.
Great, and thank you, Daniel. I'm now going to do something I haven't done before in a webinar, which is actually unmute a participant. Elizabeth Borland on the web has actually put her hand up, so I'll ask Elizabeth, if you are there, if you'd like to ask your question, I shall unmute you now. Yes, Elizabeth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I've just written it. I wasn't quite sure how to do it because I unfortunately came in late. One important consideration is our learnings from neuropsychology about fear and the way fear shuts down our rational abilities. Nukes create fear. Fear undermines rationality and provokes reactivity. And that undermines our safety. And this is a whole vicious circle. And it's such with what everyone's been saying about the state of nuclear weapons at the moment and how, we are minutes, seconds away from our world being destroyed. We need to be looking at where, as humans, we're coming from. And so fear is something that people can relate to. When we talk about nuclear weapons and things like that, it's a foreign thing often. It's something that we don't want, and yet people want to be safe. There was a wonderful talk by an ex-CIA agent talking about everyone thinks that they're the good guys. On all sides, everyone's coming from, the human needs that they're coming from, which are so important, and they think that they're the ones who are, protecting themselves and looking after what's important for them. We're wanting to protect our lifestyle, we're wanting to protect our families, we're wanting to do that. And yet, with nuclear weapons, we are undermining that. And so we need to look at, the human things that we can talk to each other about, because we can connect and people can understand basic things like safety, and basic things like wanting to care and protect for our families.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Do you have a question out of that?
So I'm just wondering, how much is that part of the debate at the moment, and is it possible to include that in? Because I guess I believe that that's a way that people can, that we can connect with people, because we need to be looking at the the more we can be looking at the reasons that people are in reaction, we can.
I can stop, Elizabeth. I'll stop you there and thank you and mute you. Thank you very much for that question. That was Elizabeth Borland from WILPF Australia. Would someone like to respond to that and comment?
Sure, I can do that if you want, Chris.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah, protection and safety are huge elements of this discourse right now, and I agree, very important. There is a sense of fear that you hear from people, not so much the governments, who understand, I think, that a lot of this is theoretical, and I think that they're more concerned with the power and prestige and political geostrategic questions of this. But I think people around the world who have heard this narrative their whole life about the protection of nuclear weapons and how nuclear weapons prevent war do have a sense that if we were to eliminate nuclear weapons or ban them, that the world would somehow be destabilized. And I think it's really important that we challenge this notion. And I think that's a great thing that the Humanitarian Initiative has been able to do, because it actually shows how nuclear weapons undermine security for everyone, regardless of where you live, regardless of whether or not your country has nuclear weapons. They make the world less secure for everyone. And also the risks of them being used, that they aren't just these magical devices that somehow prevent war, but there's actually a great risk of them being used intentionally or accidentally, and the effects that would have, and the lack of capacity from the international community to respond to these. But I think that what's really good about the Humanitarian Initiative is it hasn't done this in a fear-mongering way. It's done it in a very practical, sobering way that sets out the problem and the risks of that problem occurring, and presents a solution that is very practical as well. So I think that the more that we can sort of get this narrative out to people who do have this concern about safety, the better. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Ray.
Can I say something? It needs, Ray, of course, as you obviously know, to be broadcast far and wide in the United States. Have you any ideas about how you can do that, or what are your plans?
For getting the Humanitarian Initiative out in the United States, yes. There's a lot of groups that are actually active here that are members of ICAN, and I would say that IPPNW has been doing a lot of great work on this within their communities, and also PSR, the Physicians for Social Responsibility in DC. There's also some very grassroots local groups, such as the Los Alamos Study Group based in New Mexico, which has taken this to their communities as well. So I think that that's part of it, is having the NGOs that are part of ICAN to take this message forward. And then I also think, this is why I was mentioning media as well, I think it's really important to do background work with journalists to help change the narrative, the way that nuclear weapons are discussed when they are writing about nuclear weapons. Even if they're just writing a piece about North Korea or Iran or something that does get picked up in the news, it's important to work with people to understand the broader context of the weapons. So I think that is something that groups and individuals here can take up.
Well, can I make a suggestion, Ray, that you and your colleagues make an appointment with the editorial board of the New York Times. You can maybe take Bruce Blair with you, I don't know, and brief them upon this whole initiative. I don't think they're really aware of it, and they're starting now, at last, long last, to write some really good articles about the threat that Trump poses, not Hillary at the moment, but they're starting to wake up to what's going on. So I think it would be imperative that you go in with your colleagues and brief the editorial board of the New York Times. And you could do the Washington Post too.
Great. Thank you, Helen. I'm realizing with not a lot of time, we might go a little bit over. We now have quite a lot of questions, so we'll see if we can keep them fairly succinct in terms of me reading them out and finding them and responses. So I think I found one. Oh yeah, from Emma Gibbons in England. How can we encourage states to decommission nuclear weapons and invest in anti-climate change technology and skills? Who'd like to respond to that?
Well, that's a good one because the money that goes into nuclear weapons and all their launching systems and the like is massive. And of course, if that was diverted to saving the planet from global warming, that's a perfect solution. And you know, the factories could be converted very rapidly, as they were during the Second World War in America. Most of the factories were diverted into making tanks and planes in a very short space of time. If the momentum was there to do that, it of course would definitely help to save the planet, with every house packed with solar panels and windmills everywhere and conservation and the like. It's very obvious that that's what could and should happen.
Thank you. There's one from Mikhail or Michael Lindgren. Any thoughts on the potential positive contribution from Obama once he's ex-president?
I can try to say. I mean, you'd hope that. I think that what Obama, the Prague speech in 2009, created this kind of a lot of hope, and I think we're still recovering from the kind of disappointment in that. I think it's caused a lot of resentment and a little bit of bitterness that these kind of false promises come up and then are so quickly ignored when it comes to it. So I'd hope that Obama would be a little bit more inspired by that after when he's an ex-president. He follows perhaps the the path of presidents like Jimmy Carter, who tend to have a bigger impact when they're out of office than when they're in office. But yeah, specifically, I mean, he commands that kind of respect, and he gets a lot of coverage. So certainly, if he want to endorse the ban treaty, it's not too late, even after he's president.
Well, may I suggest that you go and make an appointment and go and see Obama? You might be able to get there, both of you.
Great, thank you. I have one from Maria Paula Cheloni. I would like to know, how do we include or understand the role of the scientific diplomacy community in this humanitarian initiative regarding the rebirth of nuclear development for alternative use, in brackets civilian use like health, energy, etc., and its relationship with the disarmament agenda? Is that one that anyone would like to pick up on?
Well, I don't know the role that the scientific community is playing in the ICAN agenda and what is going on at the United Nations. I think it's mostly diplomatic, but I don't know. But I certainly do know that there are pro-nuclear people who think that nuclear power is partly the answer to global warming because it doesn't produce CO2, which is a lie, because to mine uranium, to mill it, enrich it, and build a reactor creates a lot of CO2 global warming gas, and then you've got to store the waste for 1 million years, isolated from the ecosphere. Apart from that, it creates massive quantities of radioactive waste, which will leak into water supplies, concentrate in food supplies for the rest of time, engendering epidemics of cancer, leukemia, genetic disease, and congenital deformities. So to call it clean is a misnomer. That's my take on it, and that's from a physician's perspective and understanding quite deeply the nuclear fuel cycle.
Great, thank you, Helen. Just like to point out too that to point everybody to the chat, because you know, yeah, you can use that to make comments that everyone will be able to see that perhaps aren't questions, yeah, so we'll continue on. Actually, from Ali Al-Jabori, hi, my question is, how can we guarantee that proliferation does not happen? For example, on Amazon.com in the US, one can actually buy uranium ore. Does it mean that a proliferation can occur?
I would say definitely. I mean, proliferation can occur as long as you've got a certain group of states who claim that nuclear weapons are legitimate for their security. I mean, it's that's the biggest proliferation threat as I see it. So yeah, for sure. Until there's this universal rejection of nuclear weapons, I don't think there's much you can do to stop others from wanting to get that kind of power.
Right. Thank you. From Mikhail Lindgren, when a ban treaty is a reality, would you see former nuclear powers, for example, South Africa, Kazakhstan, with any potential role of breaking the status quo in pro of approaching concrete disarmament?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question, but
so hold on. Yeah, let me try again, Ray. I've just realised what I've misread. Yeah, so when a ban treaty is reality, would you see former nuclear powers, for example, South Africa and Kazakhstan, with any potential role of breaking the status quo in pro of approaching concrete disarmament? No, I don't think I've actually improved on it.
Right. Well, both Kazakhstan and South Africa are already very supportive of nuclear disarmament. So I think that they have some voice, particularly South Africa, in saying that they decided they did not need nuclear weapons for their security, and therefore gave them up. So I think that will be useful, certainly. But they're already saying those types of messages, and I think having them continue to say that during the ban process will be useful. I don't know if that answers the question or not.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. From Leica, Western states often pass the blame for the existence of nuclear weapons on other states. During the Cold War, it was Russia. Now it's China, DPRK, or terrorists. How can we get our governments to own up to their share of the responsibility for the continued existence and threat of nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's about it's like pointing out the hypocrisy of their position. I mean, I think there's this. I saw a document today that was handed out at the Openended working group comparing a statement made by North Korea in defense of its nuclear program and the recent declaration from Prime Minister Theresa May about why the UK needs nuclear weapons, and they're shockingly similar. So I think it's until this is where the Humanitarian Initiative comes into play, right? It points out that, as Ban Ki-moon would say, there's no right hands for the wrong weapons, and the arguments they use to defend their arsenals are the same that are being used by these so-called rogue states on the other side. So it's a matter of consistency and pointing out hypocrisy, which is a useful tool for kind of getting it into the media as well. They love that.
Great, thank you, Daniel. And I have, this is actually a question that really brings it down to, this is on the ground stuff close to us. Donna Williams says, I live within 60 miles of over 100 ICBMs. I find my fellow citizens quite resistant to education, which they see as liberal propaganda. Anyone have any success stories getting through?
Yes, I've got a suggestion, Donna, that you organise a town hall meeting like they have in New England, and you could invite Dr. Ira Helfand or me or another doctor to come and describe to them the dangers under which they're living and what could actually happen to them. I think these people don't understand, and ignorance leads to bliss, but when they're educated, that's my experience having educated hundreds of thousands of people, that as a doctor does with a patient telling them a bad diagnosis, that people come to understand quite quickly and they're motivated to do something about it.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. It sounds like a great idea. Now I've got, we have another attendee who has put her hand up, so I'll now go to Lika or Lika. In half a tick I find her again. Pardon me. Oh no! Look, I might go to I'll go to another question. I think for the time being, I've just missed. Yeah, maybe she's put her hand down. So actually, Rebecca Jeong has said that she totally agrees with what Elizabeth had said about fear provoking so much reasonable reasons for people to support the wrong decisions. She says she's from South Korea. And the general notion, what is happening in my country among numerous numbers of citizens, is that possessing nuclear weapons can secure us, which I think is very ironic. What would be an effective approach, in brackets maybe learnt by experience, to change such general public notions?
Well, here again I will intervene. It's imperative that your fellow citizens in South Korea understand the dangers under which they're living, and I know South Korea is working with America for the Asian pivot and confronting China and etc. So things are quite grim in the Asian nations, and I think that it's imperative for people in your country to be informed about the dangers, both of nuclear power, because you've got a lot of nuclear power plants, but also the dangers of nuclear weapons, and that don't make you secure at all. They make you extremely insecure and make you targets for other nuclear weapons to hit you.
I'd also just, if I just add a quick thing, it's, I mean, I think it's raising awareness around the risks of nuclear weapons, which I think has been kind of a big deal in the Humanitarian Initiative, is demonstrating how understated these risks are. And there's, I'm sure many of you have heard of this fantastic book by Eric Schlosser, Command and Control, which details a lot of these incidents, these near misses, where, you know, for no major reason, these weapons were almost, set off. So I think, those kind of things are there's also a great report by Chatham House, a research institute in the UK, about the understated risks as well. It's kind of, I think it's quite shocking, and I think people are not quite as aware of these risks as perhaps they could be.
And I'd just like to say something. I'm sitting in Seattle in a high-rise building watching the Navy practice very big fighter plane exercises right above us. So and we live, we're near Puget Sound, where many Trident submarines are located. It's very close to Seattle, and on each Trident, about 250 missiles, no, 24 missiles, each containing about 8 hydrogen bombs. So in Seattle, which is so beautiful, we're living in the heart of the nuclear danger. And here are these characters in these fighter planes flying right over us, practicing drills for war.
Blue angels.
They're called the New Angels, Blue Angels.
Wow, thank you, Helen. Another question from Michael Lindgren. Would you see the old concept of common security in brackets Helsinki process, OSCE, etc., coming back and being of use?
A
hard one.
That's a tough one. Perhaps maybe Michael could. Does he? Can we get him to speak? Maybe he knows that. I'm afraid I don't have the historical background to answer.
Yes, okay, got it. Thank you, Michael. You might like to put in a comment, perhaps, into some suggestions into the chat box. Just going through and looking for the questions that I've missed there. I just actually a comment from Nelson. Jill Stein is the only presidential candidate, Green Party, who was discussing the end of nuclear weapons. And I'm just thinking perhaps, yes, sorry, go on.
Well, yes, Jill Stein is a doctor and understands the medical implications and humanitarian, and has the guts to talk about this. All the others are intimidated. You know, even Bernie Sanders didn't discuss the threat of nuclear war, and I think he probably felt he would be attacked by the powers that be threatening national security, and there's a big feeling of nationalism at the moment in America, where it's a country of exceptionalism and the greatest country on earth, we keep hearing all the time. So I think they stay away from that subject, thinking they'll be attacked and lose their credibility. But Jill Stein, yes, is the only one addressing this issue at the moment.
Yeah. Thank you. Look, I'm going to, I'm realising we need to wind up, and I'd actually like to ask people to put in an idea of action. But I've got one last question that I realised came up earlier, and I apologise if I've missed any others along the way. This one is asking about, I haven't seen the very first one, but asking about weapons-free zones in the Middle East and Israel, especially with their Samson option perspective. I'm wondering if that's enough for you to respond to, and I'll see if I can find the initial question.
Samson option.
No, I'm sorry, I might have. Is anyone like to comment there? Is this enough? Because I'm sorry, I can't find the original question at the moment.
I can't remember what the Samson option is in the Middle East. Could someone tell us what it is?
Okay, look, we might leave that one then. Thank you. Look, thank you everybody for your wonderful contributions around this whole area and through the discussion. It's been brilliant. What I'd like to do in finishing off is to invite people to talk about, if you'd like to type in something, which is like, because this is an activist area, and it's very much about, we're here to make the difference and turn this around. And if there's something that you can do that you will take away from this webinar into your own life and world, and there might also be a takeaway or a final comment that you'd like to make. If you'd like to type that in so that everyone is able to see that. That would be great. And while you're doing that, I'd like to thank panelists, Helen, Daniel and Ray for your brilliant ongoing work and the time you've taken out today and the enormous contributions you've made in doing that. So I thank you very much.
That's my pleasure.
Thank you, Chris, for organizing.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure on a day like this, you know, Hiroshima Day and with things that are happening. It's really lovely to be able to feel that we're actually making a positive contribution and connecting with like-minded people around the world who are really committed to making that difference. Yes, I'm juggling screens here a little bit. I'm just looking to see if we've got some comments that are coming in. I can actually, what I will do is I can make some of these available actually after the webinar and send them out. So you'll receive an email with information to be able to connect in to see the recording, and I'll also provide some notes and some links too, because the presenters have provided some suggestions about you know, follow-up materials that you might like to read. So so finally, in passing, if you want to tick in, if you'd like to be notified of future webinars, that'd be great. You can just type a yes into the box and I'll understand that. And I'd like to say a very special thank you to the organisations who have been involved. Obviously, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at the international level, and in New York, who have supported Reaching Critical Will, and certainly ICAN. So thank you very much for your work. For those, if you'd like to contact any of those groups, you're welcome to go through their websites, and obviously that goes for Helen's website too, and for communicating with me regarding the webinar follow-up through that email at the bottom. So on that note, I thank you all very much. And is there anything you'd like to say? And yeah, to just, I guess, goodbye and thank you to the speakers.
Thank you.